Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 27, and verse 30 through 31. Luke 24, 13 through 27, and verses 30 through 31. Now here's reading of God's word. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed, and before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of the companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. He said to them, 'How foolish you are! How slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?' And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself." In verse 30. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. What do you think of when you hear the word revolution? Perhaps you think about a social or political revolutions, such as the American Revolution. Throughout history, though, there have been other revolutions. In the mid-20th century, somebody stumbled upon what they came to name transistor. And with that creation, the digital revolution began, and it changed the way that you and we engage the world. From the transistor came the ability for far more advanced computers, and ultimately, it spawned so many industries. Some of you are employed in that industry, but it created and it led to incredible advancements, ultimately, the internet. My kids and we talk about, sometimes Hannah and I talk about certain things and I realize even us, there's a difference in our experiences. But I remember going to college and this thing called email was just beginning, and I was like, what is this? I remember my very first computer class, a long time ago. Our school used Apple computers, and they were like these huge boxes. They're not very powerful compared to what you get today. Our smartphones are probably more powerful than those computers were. I remember one year in college, I was borrowing a friend's computer, and he's like, I don't want to leave this here during break. I was like, I can take it home for you. He said, okay. And he had a case. I packed up the monitor and all the things and keyboard into this case, and I remember carrying that thing home, opening it up and setting it up, and my parents like, what in the world is that? Because it was like this huge boxy thing. The advancements in computers and ultimately, our life with the internet, right? By the 21st century, millions of these little transistors could be placed on a single microchip. Growing up here in Portland with Intel's presence and Intel having a major R&D here in Hillsboro, I remember hearing news about how they were able to make these chips smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. They had all of these breakthrough technologies. Because of the digital revolution and the resulting ease of access to computers, our everyday life has changed one way or another. Anyone who has an access to the internet can experience life that was previously thought unattainable. From the comforts of home, you can see what's going on in other parts of the world. You can study and take classes from any university in the world from the comforts of your home. The power of the computer and the connectivity of the internet really has shrunk the world. There are vast amounts of information out there. And during COVID, we used the power of the internet to broadcast Sunday services. So that although we were prohibited from gathering, we could still have a gathering, although in or via the internet. The story of the scriptures comes to one climax with a revolution, the resurrection of Jesus. And this revolution overthrew the reign of death and brought the possibility of new life, one free from despair, one free from fear. Today is April 9th on the calendar, but it is Resurrection Sunday. This day in history changed our lives forever. After the crucifixion, the disciples, they hid in fear, fearful that they would be next. In John chapter 20, verse 19 says this, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors, locked, for fear of the Jewish leaders." They were behind doors locked. You see, the events of Friday were shocking for the disciples and for the followers of Jesus. As they watched Jesus die, things did not make sense. When they watched Jesus die, they thought that it was the end, that the final chapter was written. The religious leaders were happy to have finally rid themselves of Jesus. For several years, they had to deal with this Jesus, constantly challenging them, challenging their authority, but oftentimes making them look bad in front of all the people. They were finally happy to get rid of him. The disciples, on the other hand, they were dejected, fearful, and they were in hiding. And other followers of Jesus also were saddened. And we read about two of them this morning. Jesus has conversation with these two men on the road to Emmaus. It is clear that in their words and body language that their hopes were dashed because they had thought the final chapter was written. When we reflect upon the crucifixion, the response of the Jewish leaders was one of happiness. The disciples and followers of Jesus, it was different. There was no happiness. We discover, which is our first point this morning, that the crucifixion crushed their hopes. Look at verses 13 through 17 again. Now that same day, two of them meaning probably two of the followers of Jesus, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up, walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, and look at what he says, their faces downcast. Two men are walking. They're processing the events of the weekend. This is Sunday. They're processing the events of just the 2 days ago, Friday. Talking among themselves, and all of a sudden, this stranger comes along. He says, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" Their faces are downcast. Downcast means low in spirit, or another word is dejected. It is a stark contrast to a week earlier when the entire city was filled with excitement as Jesus entered Jerusalem for the final time during Palm Sunday. There was a mood of celebration, excitement. And 1 week later, these men are leaving. Most likely, they're returning home, had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And as they were heading back home, the mood is completely different. They're downcast, they're dejected. Verse 16 offers a very interesting little excerpt here. They were kept from recognizing him. Scholars are trying to understand what Luke meant by this. Did Jesus prevent them from recognizing him? Did the two men simply never look closely at the stranger who came alongside of them because they were so downcast? Was Jesus' post-resurrection appearance different? What kept them from recognizing Jesus? Jesus wants to know what they're talking about. And Cleopas, in verse 18 through 19, we see kind of the sarcasm in his voice. He says this, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" He's shocked by the question. He's like, "Hello, haven't you paid any attention to what's going on? Are you just coming into Jerusalem? Are you the only one?" There's a little bit of a sarcasm there. And Jesus continues on. He says, "What things?" And look at the response. "About Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, powerful in deed and word before God and all the people." In their mind, they're like, how can there be any person who does not know what happened? How can there be anyone in Jerusalem that does not know the events that had taken place? How can anyone not know? Why? Because the crucifixion was a public spectacle. Jesus was paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, and surely everyone in Jerusalem knew what had happened to Jesus. But you see, the crucifixion crushed their hopes. We see it in their response. Look at verse 21. The first part of verse 21, it says this, "But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." And it's the beginning few words here. We had hoped. Notice the past tense use of the word hope. Hoped. We had hoped. They had hoped that Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel. Hope, when we say hoped, is when we use it in the past tense, is used when when our hope does not happen. We say hoped when the thing that we hope for does not take place. I had hoped means that at one point I was hopeful. But now I am not, because what I hoped for did not happen. They recognized that Jesus of Nazareth was a prophet, powerful in word and deed. But clearly, these men didn't fully understand what the Messiah, was sent to do. They had hoped that Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel. To set them free from the bondage to Rome. Most Jews believed that the Old Testament prophecies pointed to a military and political Messiah who would deliver them from the Romans. That was what their focus was. And their words reflect that hope, but it was crushed. We had hoped. I had hoped that I would get into the college, my top choice. I had hoped. When I use that word, what does it mean? I didn't get into my top choice. I had hoped that I would be selected for the promotion, which means I was not selected. That's how we use this language. You see, in the response, we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. Tells us that the crucifixion crushed their hopes. Jesus, they had hoped, but turns out he was not the one. How can a dead man save them, right? Jesus' death brought an end to that hope. The hope that he will be the one to redeem Israel, to free us from the rule, the oppression of the Romans. Their hopes were crushed. They were convinced that this was the final chapter. The crucifixion crushed their hopes. But also, there's this element of this third day aspect The third day, second point this morning is this: the third day confirmed their fears. By all intent and purposes, many believe that the final chapter was written when Jesus died on the cross. But what about this third day and the empty tomb? Look at the second half of verse 21. It says, "What is more, it is the third day since all this took place." The third day. What is that reference to? Were these followers of Jesus, were they remembering what Jesus has said? On the third day I will rise? Possible. But there's another explanation or possibility. If you remember the story of Lazarus, you know that one of the key details in the story is that by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for how many days? 4 days. And the 4 days is significant. Why? Because Jews believed that the soul stayed around the body for up to 3 days. And by the time that Jesus arrived and Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days, what does that mean? Any ounce of hope that anyone had was gone. They held out hope for 3 days. But after that, they said, no more. There's no way. There's no hope. Is that what they're referring to today is the third day since these events have happened? There is a possibility there. But they go on and they say something else. Look at verses 22 through 24. Okay? So they say, look, what is more, today is the third day since this has happened. Verse 22, in addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. What are they thinking? Where is Jesus? What happened to Jesus? Some women went to the tomb early on Sunday morning, but they did not find Jesus' body. They relayed what they saw to the disciples, and word quickly spread. But the question raised by many was still this: where did his body go? Did someone mess with Jesus' body? Let's read Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. This is the account of the women when they went to the tomb. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices and they had prepared and went to the tomb. Verse 1, it tells us what they expected to see when they got to the tomb was a dead body. Why? They are preparing spices to go and prepare the body for burial. They were unable to do this Friday night because Sabbath was approaching, and they quickly just took the bodies down of Jesus' body down, and just laid him in the tomb. So early morning, what are they doing? Waiting for the Sabbath, right, to be over. Because if they go near any dead body during the Sabbath, it makes them unclean. So they stayed away. And the earliest possible time they could have gone was Sunday morning early, which is the story here in verse 1. Verse 2, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered it, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, because at this time already Judas had hung himself. So 11 disciples. And to all the other followers or believers of Jesus, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. He went away, wondering to himself what had happened. In the first century, in this time, the testimony of women were not regarded to be trustworthy. That, plus the fact of what they came and said, even Jesus' followers said, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. But Peter, curious, he goes. He finds things just the way that the women had described. It still doesn't dawn on him that Jesus has risen. He goes away wondering what had happened. What had happened? These two men, as they're walking back home, are also wondering what had happened. Up to this point, the thought or the possibility of the resurrection has not yet entered their minds. They operated from the perspective that the final chapter was written, that the final chapter about Jesus was finished. The story ends. Their hopes were crushed. It was the third day, and there were reports of a missing body, but still they did not make the connection. You see, the crucifixion crushed their hopes. It was the third day, and what little hope that they held out, they were told that the body is missing. Third point this morning is this: that the crucifixion is not the end, but a new beginning. Jesus' death was not the final chapter. Jesus asks them in verse 26, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and enter his glory? The key there is, and then enter his glory. Jesus is telling them that the events of that weekend have been foretold years ago. The events of the weekend should not surprise them. He wanted them to see and to believe. He says that they are foolish and slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. If these men had given more attention to the prophets, they would have been sure of Jesus' rising from the dead that morning, the third day. They would not have been dejected. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 through 5 speaks about this. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we consider him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, but he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Jesus could not have been the Savior if he had not suffered and died. It was after Jesus suffered that he would enter into glory. These disciples, they were with Jesus all those years, and yet that part just never sunk in. They were never quite able to process that part. If they had paid attention, they would not have been dejected. If they had paid attention, they would not know they would know that the final chapter was not written, that the story continues. They would know that the crucifixion is not the end, but a new beginning. Can you imagine if we knew things that were going to happen 5-10 years from now? How would we be different? I mean, not just know, but that we remember. Oh, I know what's going to happen next week. That's not going to faze me. If we are prepared, right? We can face almost anything. But the reality is we don't know. And that's why I think we respond the way that we respond to tragedies in life, circumstances that come up unexpectedly. We process bad news in a certain way. But also, it's like we're pleasantly surprised by some of the good things, good news. Look at verse 30 and 31. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. As they're traveling, it's nighttime. It's the verses in between where we didn't read it this morning, but they're like, you know what? They got to a little town. It's like, hey, we're about to, turn in for the night. Why don't you come with us? Jesus had given indication that he was going to continue. But he said, no, come. And the hospitality nature of the culture here was that, you extend hospitality to anyone. Why? Because it was not safe to travel at night. So they bring him in. They invite him to stay with them. But Jesus kind of turns the tables here. And he says, when they were eating dinner, he took the whole role of a host. What did he do? He broke the bread, he gave thanks, and he gave it to them. Now, this is not the image of the Last Supper where Jesus has done this. Jesus simply prayed, he broke the bread, and he gave it to them. And as he was doing that, their eyes were opened. Once again, how their eyes were opened, what was it about Jesus, we don't know. But at this moment, they recognized Jesus. But before they can even have any conversation, any questions, Jesus disappears. The men recognize Jesus. At the moment that they recognize him, you know what happens? The crucifixion, which had crushed their hopes, when their eyes were open and they saw Jesus, hope is restored. Hope is renewed. You know, God's plan of salvation required that Christ suffered before being glorified. And as a result, salvation is available. Friday night, during our Good Friday service, I said Friday is bittersweet. There's sadness because of suffering and death. But it's bittersweet because we know that death ultimately leads to the resurrection. The resurrection has changed the world. The two men in our story are saddened because their hopes, or because of their misplaced hope. They thought that Jesus would deliver them and all Israel from the oppression of the Romans. Their outlook, however, was transformed when they shared a meal with the resurrected Lord. Their eyes were open and they saw Jesus. The resurrection changed their lives both in the immediate and the future. In the future, what happened? Because of the resurrected Lord, the way to heaven, the hope of heaven was opened. But in the immediate, what happened was that they turn around. They don't go back home. They turn around and they return to Jerusalem. Why did they go back? They didn't continue home because they went back and they had to tell others, we saw the Lord. Why? Because they heard the testimony of the women, but they didn't believe it. Even Peter's testimony, the tomb was empty. We know that Peter and John, in John's gospel, John tells us that he ran. John kind of tells us, but I outran him. I got to the tomb first. Well, he doesn't use first person, but basically, he's like, and then the other disciple came. John gets to the tomb to just look in. Peter comes and runs into the tomb. That's kind of Peter's personality, right? They go back. Why? Because they had to turn around and tell others that Jesus was alive. They wanted others to know that the final chapter has not been written. The wonderful story continues. In fact, there is a new beginning. Let me invite the worship team up. It is sad that Jesus suffered and died, but on the third day, he rose from the grave. Jesus is alive. This is the message of the Resurrection Sunday. Jesus is alive. Many had concluded that the final chapter had been written. They had lost hope. They were dejected. As you read through the gospel narratives of the post-resurrection life, even a week after, I think it's in Mark's gospel, and as well as in John's gospel, even a week after, disciples were still behind locked doors. In John chapter 20, verse 21, chapter 21, we read about how Jesus appeared to them 2 times, and yet they're still, a week after, still behind closed doors, locked doors. There was still that fear. Even after the Lord appeared and said, here, look at the scars. Touch me. I am flesh. I am no ghost. They had thought the final chapter was written. The crucifixion crushed their hopes. They were dejected. But the final chapter was not written, rather a new beginning. Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the third day. This is the central message of our faith. For the resurrection changed life for all humanity. What is our response? Our response is to believe it. Second, like these two men, to go tell others about it. Let's reflect and respond in song this morning.